Well, one of the connections Charlie was just talking about is the pig issue. If these upper conservation areas are dug up badly through pig activity, there can be erosion. If it's happening in an area with hydrologic connectivity to the streams, it can be a source of introducing a lot of sediment down into the nearshore water. So the overall health and integrity and management of the upper conservation areas, in addition to being the sponge that collects the water that serves most of the island through its public system, it also helps to keep the quality of the coastal ecosystem. Probably the key message is that it requires long-term attention in order to deal with issues. The upper areas need long-term management, and for managing the agricultural and urban areas in between, you have to have a long-term commitment to that too, because things haven't necessarily been set up or laid out in a way that is conducive to preserving the health along the coast. So we've formed the initiative, there's a lot of momentum behind it and players at the table, but we need to keep the attention there to give time for the projects to mature and the shift in the awareness of the community and the local political environment, so that taking care from ridge to reef becomes just a part of the ethic here. The agricultural roads, for example, they're running Malka to Mackay, not because that's a sensible way to deal with your water, but because it's the way to maximize your field's dimensions. And a lot of basins went in following the concern over algae blooms in the 90s, and that did a lot to reduce the amount of sediment making its way to the shore, and smothering the reefs. But there's still room for more refinement as our thinking evolves. Managing stormwater from impervious surfaces in urban areas is another opportunity for making adjustments at the county-wide scale that could make a big difference in the long run. The goal of the West Maui Ridge to Reef Initiative is to identify and address the sources of land-based pollution, to reduce stress on coral reef, and to do so in a way that's congruent with the values and attitudes of West Maui. Well, the thinking behind including that in the goal is that this really has to be community-based, not community-placed. And so trying to work with the community throughout the planning process so that their viewpoints and what's important to them is also incorporated in the planning. So one way is there periodically are public meetings that go along with each phase in drafting up the plans, and the input from that is taken and incorporated. And the more real-time way that that's happening is the Ridge to Reef has a local working group that advises and kind of ground truths everything that's happening. And that local working group is made up out of representatives from the various interests in West Maui. And we used to meet every month, now we meet every 2 months. So every project, every plan, everything that's being pursued by the R2R in West Maui gets passed through that team. And they help to make sure the ideas are sound, or they help to remove the barriers where there are barriers, and they're a tremendously important part of that kind of ground truthing aspect of the implementation and planning work. We are only dealing with 5, and we're doing that in 2 phases. The first phase is Wahikuli and Honokawai, and then the second phase we're starting now is moving north up to Honolua watershed. So Honokohua and Kahana in there too. The reason that we're not taking on a larger area is that there are not endless resources, and so rather than doing a bad job at a large area, we're trying to really focus, and by focusing, test this model of doing site-specific planning and implementation and science, and hopefully moving the needle on coral reef health.
And then so some of the lessons learned now presumably will inform future decisions for future watershed action.
That's the hope. Clean water, a reef that persists for generations, and keeping the pollutants out of our environment is generally what people can get behind. That's not to say there aren't parts of the community that have a little bit of suspicion about any process that's coming from the outside. But overall, definitely on an individual basis, people have been behind it. And we have a really great volunteer community made of Mackay Watch volunteers and then other R2R volunteers. Some people have given a lot of time for working on the projects and being the education and outreach spokespeople for what we're trying to do in West Maui. So that's been great. Biggest challenges are probably that sometimes at the local government level, there isn't the capacity or the resources to do what we would all like to see done. There are also often delays and bureaucratic hang-ups. Sometimes the grant funding cycle, which we're grateful for, without the grants things wouldn't move forward, but sometimes it'll take a year and a half or 2 years between project conception to actually implementing, which presents challenges when you're having to get people on board for that and commit resources, and then it's years before anything really happens. But we're working around those barriers.